Hey everyone, I got my glasses on. You know what that means. It's time for Reading with Rob. Today's book is called Barracoon. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's has a word that has Portuguese roots, and it basically means barracks. And it's referencing where slaves were held as they were on their way to the Americas from Africa on the coast. They would be held in some barracks, or as called Barracoon. So as you can guess, this book is about slavery, but it's an interesting angle that I had not read before. It's by an author, Zora Neale Hurston. And she is the reason that I picked up the book, not the subject matter, but I'm so happy I did because the subject matter is fascinating. So Zora Neale Hurston, I first heard about when I was down in Central Florida. I went to this community called the Goldsboro Historic District. It's right outside of Sanford, Florida, and they have several museums. It's actually the Goldsboro Historic Arts and Cultural Center. And so there's, I think, about 3 museums there where you can learn a lot about African-American culture. And the reason Goldsboro is significant is it is one of the first 2 incorporated Black townships in the United States. It only lasted for about 20 or so years before it got absorbed into Sanford, but it was one of the first 2 Black townships. So there's a lot of African-American history there. And during my visit, we were filming. I had the good fortune to meet up with Pasha, who kind of heads up the place. And Pasha is just a wealth of knowledge about African-American culture. And I thought I was pretty well versed. I've read a lot of Black authors. I've studied a lot of civil rights history. I've seen a ton of documentaries. And, and I'm from the South, so it's kind of something I notice. And this experience with Pasha told me I didn't know what I didn't know. And it was an incredible experience. I said, there's still so much more for me to learn. And so I saw this author, Zora Neale Hurston, a display about her. And we never really got the chance to talk about it in the show. But when I got back to New York, I did some research on her, and I said, wow, this is a fascinating lady. So Zora Neale Hurston was an author and an anthropologist, one of the leading, if not the leading, African-American anthropologists at the time, focused almost entirely on documenting the African-American experience, the history, the folk culture. And so she was, and I think this was one of her first projects, so she was perfectly set up to write this. And so Zora is from Central Florida. I think she's from a town called Eatonville, which is another historical black town near Goldsboro. And she, I think, had moved to New York, had found some benefactors and some people to help support her work, as all anthropologists needed at the time. And so she went all the way down to near Mobile, Alabama, to a town, I think that is today called Plateau, but at the time it's called Africatown, to interview what essentially was the last surviving slave to come from Africa. Now, if you're familiar with abolition, which I'm sure you are, when slavery was abolished and the Civil War and all that stuff, prior to abolition, slave ships and the buying of slaves from Africa was forbidden. It was illegal. The federal government made a law against it. And so that was kind of the first step. And so everybody that had been grandfathered in, they were, they reached a compromise, said, okay, they're still slaves, but you can't bring any new ones in. Well, some plantation owners down in southern Alabama got a little greedy, said, you know what, we need some more. And evidently they found out that there was a war going on between a couple of tribes in Western Africa. And I'm simplifying this, by the way. You got to read the book. But basically, in Africa, what would happen is, as the tribes would war with each other, the victorious tribe, in some situations, would kill the people they captured. Sometimes they'd absorb them into their tribe, maybe, or in the case of many cases, they would actually sell them into slavery. And so these guys got word that there were some available captured enemies of this particular tribe. And this guy, Cujo, which is his Americanized name, not his African name, was one of those folks. He was about 19 years old, if memory recalls, when he was captured. And so they took this ship from Alabama to Africa to go pick these guys up. So Cujo, at this point, when Zora is interviewing him, is I think in his 70s or 80s. He's an old man now. He hasn't lived in Africa for many, many decades. And people wanted to document and get his stories before he died, before he passed on, because he was the last living relic. Similar today, like, you know, people from the Holocaust are dying off, people from World War II. And so those stories become more and more valuable as they begin, as the people that lived that experience died out. So Cujo was kind of fortunate, at least relative to other slaves, in that he was kidnapped, enslaved late in the process. So, you know, this talks about his life in Africa, and his tribe in particular, that he was a member of, had an extreme talent for memory, remembering things, for a great memory. And I did not realize that until I got in the back of the book into the appendix, because the whole time I'm reading it, I'm like, this is very detailed. How did this guy remember all this level of detail? And so they played memory games as kids, and it gets into that in the appendix. So I found that really fascinating. So he actually talks about his life in Africa during that time in the late 1800s or the mid 1800s. And then the ship right over. The reason I say that he was lucky is because the ship was not packed full like most slave ships were. But that doesn't mean it was a picnic, not by any means. They were still down in the cargo. They couldn't stand up. Obviously, seasickness was a thing. They had very little to eat, not enough to drink. They were down there for days at a time, no air, suffocating. It doesn't mention that anyone died on the way over, which we know did happen with slave ships. So relatively speaking, again, he had a pretty decent time. He also caught a break when they brought the ship to Alabama. His owner was one of the better ones. They weren't one of the more cruel owners, at least according to Cujo. So when they finally brought him to Alabama, they had to sneak the ship in at night. It was very serendipitous. And then they unloaded the slaves. They had to get them some clothes so they would kind of blend in. And then they burned the ship. And I don't know if you watch 60 Minutes, but if you do, 60 Minutes had a profile on this not long ago about Africa Town and about this ship. And I didn't realize the connection until I read the book. They burned the ship because they didn't want evidence of their crime to exist. So they burned it, and it sunk at the bottom of one of the rivers there. And I think it's still there, and you can still see it. So it's pretty amazing. So Africa Town today doesn't exist, but basically what Africa Town is people like Cujo. They were slaves for about 5 years, and then they were free, and they had nowhere to go. And so there were really two sets of African slaves. There were the people that were born in the United States into slavery, and then people that had been brought over from Africa, and they were kind of separated a little bit. And the people that were brought over from Africa had a real tough time. Well, they all had a tough time, but these guys had a particularly tough time because they were still adjusting to this new society, and which had not been friendly to them. And so, you know, they decided to get together and work hard and save some money and buy some land and create their own society, and they called it Africa Town. Very fascinating stuff. Cujo had a tragic life, but he also had a beautiful life, and you could tell he has a beautiful soul. And you can also tell Zora has a beautiful way of writing. I love the way she writes. She tells Cujo's story in his own words, in his own dialect. So you kind of have to, like, you know, instead of they, D-H-E-Y, it's like they, D-E-Y. They draw de lot, and de lot fell on Jonah. So they draw the lot, and the lot fell on Jonah. He's talking about Jonah in the well. So, you know, be prepared for that. But it moves really fast. It's set up by Zora. She puts it into context. And then afterwards, there's a huge appendix that gets into some notes, some glossary, talks a little bit about Zora's life, which is also pretty fascinating. And this is just the beginning of my journey into Zora Neale Hurston, because I want to see what her writing is like in a novel, which she's written some. So I want to see what that's like as opposed to just, you know, an interview. But as far as the first book, this was a fantastic one. I highly recommend it. So it's Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo, and Zora Neale Hurston. You can buy it on Amazon, I'm sure. But as always, I encourage you to try to buy from a local or small bookseller. They're usually about the same price. Maybe they can be delivered on Prime or however you get your books. If you want to save some money, money is tight, try looking at some pre-loved books like this one was when I bought it and will be when I donate it. All right, guys, that's it. That's Reading with Rob. Thanks for paying attention. Barracoon. It's well worth the read. Thanks a lot. See you next time.